Hi everybody, my name's Tim Gresh. I'm a professional bike fitter in Westchester, Pennsylvania, and this video will be on crank length. Crank length is a very important thing to performing well on the bike. It's a topic that I think is fairly common right now across the internet in terms of what crank length should we be using. In this video, I want to be a little bit specific on who this is for because I don't like to generalize because everyone's so different in what they need. So in this video, it's really going to be for folks that are about 5'6" and below. I'm going to draw the line there. So if you're watching this video and you're 5'6" and under, male or female, then this will likely apply to you. So in terms of the bike that we're referring to, this would be for road bikes, gravel bikes, and triathlon bikes primarily, what this topic would apply to. Now, let's talk a little bit about what lengths there are. So 175, 172.5, 170, 165. Okay, those numbers don't really mean a whole lot, so what I would like you to do is you can pause this video or go grab your bike and look at your crank length and see what you got. On your crank, on the inside where the pedal threads in, you're going to see something stamped or written in there. It'll be a number, one of these, 175, 172.5s, 170, or maybe 165s. If you have 165s, that's great because 165 is the shortest production length used. And surprisingly, I don't see that on a lot of smaller bikes. It's very common for me to see bikes that are, say, a 50 centimeter or 47 centimeter frame that have one of these three crank lengths here. And if you've got one of these here, 175, 172.5, or 170, you're probably riding cranks that are too long, and you would benefit from having at least 165s, if not one of these guys here, which I consider shorter cranks, and that's 160, 155, 150, and 145. And these cranks here would be aftermarket. They wouldn't be made by Shimano or SRAM. It'd be another company. I won't get into the weeds of how all that works, but bottom line is that they do exist, and it is something that we can change. You aren't stuck with these crank lengths here. And I think the bike industry has been a little lazy with getting the right crank length on bikes. Because we have these slim pickings on mass-produced cranks, bikes just sort of get whatever they get, and you don't really have any control over that. But it is important to have the right one. And in a lot of cases, folks 5'6" and under, 155 seems to be the one that I put a lot of people on, mainly because after I test them out at this length, and here at the studio I have a sizing cycle where I can actually replicate any of these crank lengths and have the rider pedal under load and test these out. And I can see how stable they are in the saddle. Oftentimes 155, just for whatever reason, ends up being pretty popular, although I've used 150s, I've used 145s, I've used 160s plenty of time. But bottom line is that one of these four cranks here is probably what's going to be good for you. So let's talk a little bit about what this really means, like why are shorter cranks going to be better. And a good way to illustrate that would be talking about the size of the circle that you're pedaling in. And that's what changes when you change your crank length. So I'm going to grab two cranks here. One of them is fairly long. This is actually a 175. So this is one of the longer mass-produced cranks that you can get. And this one here is a 150. Okay, so this is what I would consider a shorter crank. So what we're going to do here is on the board, going to make a little dot. So that's going to represent your bottom bracket. And your bottom bracket is the center of the bike where the crank's attached to and rotate on. And we're going to use the 170 here first. Kind of go like that. This is not an exact science, but it's good enough for what we need here. That's not too bad. So that is a 175 crank. So you can see the size of that circle that you're going to have to pedal through. Now I'm going to grab my 150 crank, do the same thing, this time with a different color marker, like that. Trace around, oh, there we go. That's not too bad. Looks pretty good. So the black one is 170, the red one is a 155. You can see the difference in that size of the circle. So it's going to be easier to pedal through this red circle than the black one. And when you're pedaling in too big of a circle, what ends up happening is that you have to sort of waddle in the saddle, for lack of better words. So it kind of creates a little bit of a rocking side to side as you're trying to get through that range of motion with a circle that's too big. With a smaller circle, you're able to get through that better because it's more proportional to your leg length and where your seat height is located. And if you're 5'6" or under, your seat's going to be on the lower side. So you're going to need a smaller circle to pedal in. Now, let's talk about what does cranks at too long cause, aside from what I just said there in that rocking in the saddle, but what are some of the symptoms? So the first one, and there's a lot of different symptoms, I'm going to touch on sort of the common ones. That would be lower back and hip discomfort because you're rocking in that saddle side to side too much, trying to fight that crank that's too big. Lower back's going to work a little bit harder than it should, so you might get some lower back pain, and also discomfort around the hips and pain in the hips because you're just pushing through this range of motion that is out of proportion to what you can handle. Trouble on climbs, I hear this a lot. This one's really interesting because the riders will oftentimes be, smaller and light, and they should be good climbers, but they actually struggle on the climbs or don't feel very good on the climbs or as good as they think they should be because they can't really just settle into the saddle and put out a nice steady effort because they're fighting those cranks. Another one would be can't ride at high RPMs. So that is, again, I'm going to keep repeating this, the size of the circle. When you're pedaling in too big of a circle, it's hard to keep that leg speed up and keep those RPMs up. So riders that tend to ride at, say, 80 RPM or under, they kind of gravitate to that RPM range. That's because their riding cranks are too long, typically. So that can be resolved with shorter cranks. Last one, saddle. So what that refers to is really just like everything related to saddle discomfort or having trouble finding the right saddle because you're moving too much side to side. There's a lot of excess movement and chafing, having a hard time finding the perfect saddle, having lots of saddle sores and other things related to that. I've seen that be a symptom of the cranks too long. Now, to finish this off, what happens when we have the right crank length? What can you expect? Aside from these top things that I mentioned being pretty much resolved or mostly resolved when the right crank length is installed, another thing that I notice is folks will say getting out of the saddle is smoother. So when they get to a climb and they get out of the saddle, there's no dead spot or clunkiness in that transition. They're able to just kind of get out of the saddle and go and keep contact with the pedals because they're in a circle that's proportional and it's not this awkward transition. Another one would be feeling that locked in and stable feeling because they're not wobbling in the saddle too much, trying to get over that big circle. They're just static in the saddle. They just feel very stable and locked in. And that's fundamental to bike fit. In my future videos that I do, I'll dive into the weeds of that. But fundamentally, a good position is one where you are stable in the saddle while you're under load, or as stable as possible. Another one is just feels natural. You just kind of feel like the bike is an extension of your body, and it just feels very natural. You're able to move through that pedal stroke nicely. Last one is it takes time, and that refers to when we change crank length, it's a pretty profound thing to change. When you're going from moving in this motion, a big circle, to a smaller one, that sequence of muscle firing is much different. And it takes some time to get used to it. And if you've been riding for years with that longer crank, your body knows how to move through that range of motion. And it can take a little bit for you to adapt to the shorter cranks. So it's fairly common for folks to come back to me maybe a month or two after we've changed the cranks, and at that point say, wow, it's really clicked. Now I'm really feeling good. And one quick example is a customer of mine who always had issues with their hip, and they'd always have to go to see a massage therapist to get worked on because the muscles would be very tight. They had to kind of work these knots out. And after we kind of dived into their fit, figured out that the cranks were too big, it was causing too much rocking in the saddle. We addressed that. We put 155 cranks on at the time, and they're still using 155s. They felt better. Everything was great. They still had to see the massage therapist, but after about a month or so, no more massage therapists. They didn't need any of that maintenance to keep themselves healthy because they were now fully adapted to it. And they had accepted that going to the massage therapist was just part of being a cyclist. Like a lot of discomforts that we get in cycling, you accept that it's part of the sport, but a lot of these are not. And this particular individual felt like it was, and once they fully adapted, it went away. And that was awesome. So crank length is a big deal. I hope that this video was helpful to you and you learned something. Go check the length of your cranks and see what you got. If there's anybody that you think might benefit from this video, please share it. If you have any questions, leave it in the comments below. If you have any thoughts on topics for me to cover in the future, please leave them in the comments below as well. Thanks for watching.